Hey everyone, welcome back to Minute 60. Tonight, I've got one terrifying true story about a new neighbor that will make you question the safety of your own street. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, and settle in, because once we start, you'll want to keep listening all the way through. If you're new here, this is the channel where we share creepy, true scary stories that are perfect for late nights and sleepless hours. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your state, city, or even your country in the comments. It's always awesome to see this creepy little community stretch across the US and the world. And hey, if you love scary stories, make sure you hit subscribe and tap the bell, because we've got new nightmares for you every single day. All right, let's get into it. The street was unusually still that afternoon, almost unnervingly so. Even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing gently against the trees as if it, too, sensed the change. Every small sound, the hum of a distant car, the faint rustle of leaves, the occasional bark of a dog, felt magnified, echoing unnaturally along the empty sidewalks. Then, around the corner, a moving van appeared, heavy and deliberate. Its engine rumbled low, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the pavement and linger in the air long after it passed. Boxes were stacked carefully on the curb, and the air seemed to thicken as the new resident stepped out. The man was tall, with sharp features that caught the fading sunlight in strange ways. His eyes swept the street constantly, restless, alert, almost predatory. Every movement he made was deliberate, precise, and unsettling. The woman beside him carried a smaller box, her expression unreadable, almost hollow. She followed him in silence, moving like a shadow tethered to his presence. From the window across the street, the protagonist watched, unable to look away despite the rising unease curling through their chest. The house itself seemed different. The sunlight hit the walls, but it didn't reflect or warm them the way it did other homes. It was like the house absorbed the light, leaving only a faint shadow hovering across the lawn. A stray dog approached the yard, barking in sharp, insistent bursts. The man didn't even glance at it. The dog's barking grew frantic before it turned and fled, tail between its legs, as though even it could sense the unnatural energy surrounding the house. As the sun dipped lower, long shadows stretched unnaturally across the lawn. They didn't align with the shapes of the trees or the fence. Instead, they clung to the house like dark tendrils, reaching outward. The protagonist could feel a chill crawling up their spine, prickling their skin in ways words couldn't capture. From somewhere in the backyard, a metallic clang rang sharply, echoing through the street. The sound startled the protagonist, who immediately pressed against the window. There was nothing visible outside, only the lingering echo and a sudden stillness that followed, heavier than the day before. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. Through a slightly open blind, subtle movements could be seen. A fleeting silhouette, a hand brushing against a wall, a figure turning, but then nothing, as if it had never been there. The protagonist's heartbeat quickened. Every ordinary sound, the rustling of leaves, the hum of the street, even distant laughter felt amplified, menacing, like the air itself carried a warning. Night fell fully, and the street became a canvas of darkness. Every familiar landmark seemed altered, threatening. The house sat silently, but the sense of observation, of something waiting, was palpable. For the first time in years, the quiet street didn't feel safe. It felt alive, and it was watching. Morning arrived with a pale, hesitant light filtering weakly through the blinds. The protagonist peered outside, and immediately a shiver ran down their spine. The new neighbor was already outside, tending to a small patch of plants with slow, meticulous movements. Yet his eyes never rested on what he was doing. They constantly swept across the street, alert, calculating, as if measuring everything in his view. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he didn't acknowledge the protagonist at all. His calmness was unsettling, almost mechanical, like a perfectly wound clock moving through a world it didn't belong to. The blinds across every window of the house were drawn tight. No light escaped, no furniture or decorations hinted at life inside. Just dark rectangles staring silently at the street, as if the walls themselves were watching. Even from a distance, the house exuded a cold weight. The sunlight seemed absorbed rather than reflected, and the air around it felt heavier, slightly damp, as if carrying a warning the protagonist couldn't quite name. During a morning walk, the protagonist noticed the man standing near the property's edge. As soon as someone approached, he vanished into the house, reappearing moments later in a completely different position. His movements were impossible to predict, almost as though the house itself moved him. Footsteps echoed softly on the wooden porch, though no one emerged. The air seemed to hold its breath. Even the birds had gone silent, their chirps replaced by a tense, unnatural quiet. A faint, scratching noise came from the driveway. The neighbor didn't react, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. A lingering echo remained, curling like smoke through the street. Other neighbors whispered among themselves, voices low and cautious, hinting at deliveries at odd hours, unexplained patterns and strange behavior. Yet no one confronted the newcomers. Fear and curiosity tangled together, keeping everyone at a distance. As evening drew near, the shadows stretched across the protagonist's lawn, unnaturally long, creeping toward the house as if drawn by some unseen force. Through a narrow crack in the blinds, the neighbor's silhouette appeared, still observing, almost waiting for something to happen. That night, a faint, flickering light glowed in the basement window. It wasn't steady and it wasn't warm. It pulsed like a heartbeat, subtle but insistent. The protagonist lay awake, imagining impossible shapes moving behind the glass, their mind filling in the gaps with horrors the eye could not see. Something was alive in that house, and it was aware of them. The next morning, the protagonist found a folded note tucked into their mailbox. The paper was plain, the handwriting jagged and deliberate. It read simply, "Watch carefully." A shiver ran down their spine. There was no name, no indication of who could have left it. Only the message, stark and unnerving. Later that day, while running errands, the protagonist spotted the neighbor again. He was standing silently across an aisle at the grocery store, staring without moving, without blinking. When they looked again a moment later, he was gone, vanishing as though he had never been there. Even the animals behaved strangely. Birds hesitated to land near the house, skittish and restless. Cats hissed and padded cautiously along fences. A squirrel paused mid-leap, then retreated, as if some invisible force repelled it from the yard. Night brought new sounds. Faint scraping, muffled thuds, and soft whispers drifted from the backyard. They were too quiet to identify, too irregular to ignore, and yet unmistakable in their presence. The protagonist began noticing patterns. Every time the neighbor appeared, the temperature dropped slightly, shadows stretched longer than they should, and the air felt heavier, almost charged. Something about him disturbed the natural rhythm of the street. Security cameras set up around the property revealed fleeting shapes inside the house, a shadow moving across a wall, a hand brushing a table, a figure bending in impossible angles. Nothing ever fully visible, yet undeniably there. The neighbor's gaze, even when he wasn't physically present, seemed to linger. Glances from upstairs windows, reflections in car mirrors, fleeting glimpses in shop windows, all suggested he was watching. always watching. Even ordinary sounds became threatening. Leaves rustling, distant traffic, a cat yowling, all amplified in a way that felt intentional, as if the house itself amplified unease. That night, sleep became a battleground. Dreams were invaded by dark silhouettes standing just beyond the window, stretching impossibly tall, watching, always watching. The protagonist awoke drenched in sweat, the echo of whispered words lingering in the room, though no one was there. Something about the new neighbor was slowly unraveling reality itself. The quiet street that had once been familiar now felt alien, dangerous, and alive. The days that followed felt heavier than normal. Every sound, every shadow, every glimpse of movement made the protagonist's skin crawl. The neighbor's presence seemed to extend beyond the house, seeping into the street itself. Attempts at casual interaction were met with a stare that chilled to the bone. The man's head would tilt unnaturally, his lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile that seemed to see far deeper than it should, assessing, calculating, weighing. Animals reacted badly whenever he passed. Dogs barked frantically, cats hissed and fled. Even insects seemed to avoid the yard altogether. It was as if the natural world itself recognized him as something unnatural. Strange smells began drifting from the backyard at night, metallic, earthy, chemical. They clung to the air, impossible to locate, leaving a lingering nausea that made the protagonist's chest tighten. Street cameras caught unsettling movements, shadows slipping out of the basement, bending in impossible ways, lingering near windows before vanishing. Whispers began to carry through the quiet street. Almost inaudible at first, the soft, sibilant words seemed to come from the air itself, brushing against the ears in half-formed sentences. Even other neighbors noticed. Some whispered nervously about deliveries at odd hours, strange figures glimpsed through curtains, and eerie lights flickering late at night. But nobody dared confront the new residents directly. Lights around the property began flickering at irregular intervals. At times the house seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting subtly, casting fleeting shadows that moved independently of any visible source. The protagonist began keeping a journal, recording every detail, every creak, every flicker of light, every shadow that moved unnaturally. Paranoia gnawed relentlessly, making ordinary tasks feel hazardous. By the end of the week, it was impossible to ignore the truth. The quiet street was no longer safe. Something about the neighbor, something about the house, was profoundly wrong, and it was only getting stronger. One morning, the protagonist noticed a window that had always been closed slightly ajar. From the street, a flicker of movement was visible inside. A shadow shifted in a way that didn't match any natural movement, as if the house itself were alive. In the backyard, the soil had been disturbed overnight. Strange symbols were etched into the ground, geometric patterns, precise and deliberate, too intricate to be accidental. A chill ran down the protagonist's spine. Whoever, or whatever, had done this was meticulous and deliberate. Security footage revealed fleeting glimpses of figures entering the house, but none ever emerged. The shadows inside moved in ways that defied logic, bending around corners and doors in impossible angles. A soft knock sounded at the protagonist's door one night. Heart-pounding, they opened it, but no one was there. Only the echo of the sound lingered, carried away by the silent street. Inside the house, small objects had shifted slightly, a chair now angled toward the window, a book turned open to an unfamiliar page. Nothing appeared stolen, nothing added, just subtle, eerie changes that implied observation, intrusion. Neighbors whispered quietly about odd happenings, missing items, strange packages that arrived without explanation, and glimpses of figures through drawn curtains at odd hours. Fear hung thick in the air, yet curiosity kept most at a distance. Streetlights around the house flickered at irregular intervals, plunging patches of the yard into darkness. The shadows stretched long and unnatural, clawing across the lawn as if alive. Every recorded sound, creaks, thuds, whispers, was amplified in the protagonist's mind. Even the faintest noises felt threatening, deliberate, like warnings or messages from the house itself. By now the house seemed almost sentient. It breathed in rhythm with the night, pulsing with an unseen life, observing, learning, and waiting. The protagonist realized with a cold certainty that the quiet street was no longer just unnerving. It was dangerous. And the danger wasn't outside, it was watching, inside, always watching. The protagonist set up cameras around the property, determined to capture the strange occurrences that had haunted their days and nights. Almost immediately, irregularities appeared. Doors that had been closed perfectly the night before were now slightly ajar. Lights switched on and off with no explanation, as if the house itself were testing the limits of control. Soft, almost imperceptible noises echoed through the walls, scraping, humming, whispering. They weren't loud, but they carried an unnerving weight, a presence that made every step in the house feel dangerous. The neighbor appeared unpredictably. Sometimes he was across the street, standing perfectly still. Sometimes he was at the edge of the yard, watching from behind a bush. Every appearance was calculated, precise, unnervingly intentional. Near the edge of the backyard, the protagonist discovered a journal partially buried in the soil. Its pages were filled with obsessive notes, patterns of watching, recordings of street activity, diagrams of shadows, and cryptic, repetitive markings. Whoever had written it had an unhealthy, almost ritualistic fixation. Even familiar spaces felt threatening. Shadows stretched impossibly long, bending at strange angles across walls and sidewalks. Pets refused to enter certain rooms, growling at nothing. Mirrors reflected fleeting figures that disappeared as soon as they were noticed. Patterns began to emerge. Every night lights flickered at specific times, scraping noises repeated in cycles. Shadows appeared in predictable yet impossible locations. The protagonist could almost predict when and where the next oddity would occur, but the sense of dread never lessened. Sleep became impossible. Dreams were plagued by dark figures moving just beyond windows, whispering unintelligible words. The line between waking and sleeping blurred as anxiety and fear seeped into every moment. By the end of the week, the protagonist felt trapped. Every glance toward the house sent a shiver down the spine. Every movement outside was calculated and watched. The street that had once been familiar now seemed like a stage, and the neighbor, the director of a performance the protagonist could not control. The house pulsed with silent intent, alive in a way that defied logic. And the protagonist knew with an undeniable certainty that their life had become entwined with something beyond understanding. After days of silent observation, the protagonist finally gathered enough courage to step outside and confront the neighbor directly. The evening air was thick, the kind that clung to the skin and made every movement feel heavier. As they approached the yard, the man appeared almost instantly, as if he had been waiting. He tilted his head unnaturally, eyes locked onto the protagonist's with an intensity that felt suffocating. His smile was slow, deliberate, and didn't reach his eyes, a smile that seemed to see far deeper than it should. "You shouldn't look too closely," he whispered, his voice low but sharp, echoing in the air long after he walked away. The protagonist froze, heart racing, every instinct screaming to retreat. But curiosity and fear twisted together, holding them rooted to the spot. That night, the basement lights flickered again, revealing impossible silhouettes moving behind the drawn curtains. shadows stretched and bent at angles no human body should be able to achieve. A neighbour's dog that had wandered into the yard days before was now gone, replaced by an unidentifiable object lying carefully in the grass. Its purpose or meaning was unclear, but its placement was deliberate. Ordinary sounds became triggers of panic. A gust of wind rattled leaves across the street. A distant car horn echoed sharply. Every noise felt magnified, deliberate, threatening. The house itself seemed heavier, more present, as if it were a living thing that could sense fear. Every creak of the floor, every faint rustle of the trees seemed choreographed to unsettle. Reflections in mirrors betrayed glimpses of the neighbour behind the protagonist, fleeting yet unmistakable. Each reflection made the room feel smaller, the walls closer, the shadows darker. Other neighbours began avoiding the street entirely at night, leaving the protagonist isolated. The quiet that had once felt comforting now pressed in like a predator, waiting to strike. By the end of the confrontation, the protagonist realized a terrifying truth. The danger wasn't in the street, and it wasn't even entirely in the neighbour. The house, the shadows, the unseen forces lurking around the property, they were all part of a larger watching presence, and it was aware of them. The unsettling occurrences continued, each day more intense than the last. Objects inside the protagonist's home shifted without explanation. A chair slightly angled toward the window, a book opened to an unfamiliar page, a cup moved an inch to the side. It was subtle but deliberate, a reminder that they were being watched. The mailbox no longer contained just letters. Hair, strange small objects and cryptic notes appeared inside. Some of the notes carried single words or phrases. Don't look, it sees, stay inside. Each one made the blood run colder than the last. Streetlights flickered erratically, but only around the new neighbour's property. Small pockets of darkness formed along the sidewalk, stretching unnaturally and clawing across the lawn. Through a narrow crack in the blinds, the protagonist glimpsed the neighbour standing still, staring directly into their eyes, smiling faintly. Even though he made no move, the gaze was heavy, suffocating, a silent declaration of control. Pets grew increasingly anxious, refusing to enter certain rooms. Dogs whimpered, cats hissed, insects scuttled frantically. Any living thing seemed to sense the unnatural presence and wanted nothing to do with it. Sleep became impossible. Every rest period was invaded by dreams filled with impossible shapes, shadows creeping across ceilings, whispers curling around the ears. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. Phone calls near the house were mysteriously disconnected or filled with static. Electronic devices malfunctioned sporadically, lights flickering, screens freezing, alarms going off without reason. Even the neighbours began to act strangely. Some avoided the street entirely, while others watched silently from a distance, their expressions blank or fearful. The protagonist felt isolated, trapped, and constantly observed. By this point, it was undeniable. The malice wasn't just the neighbour, it was the house, the shadows, the very air surrounding the property. Every step, every glance, every breath felt monitored. The protagonist realized with sinking dread that the street itself, once familiar and safe, had become a trap. And the closer they looked, the more dangerous the world became. Late at night, the street was swallowed in a thick darkness. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed absent, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed on the protagonist's chest. Then sudden lights flashed in the basement window of the new neighbour's house, bright and erratic, illuminating shapes that defied explanation. Driven by a mixture of fear and desperation, the protagonist crept closer to the house. Inside the basement, glimpses revealed strange machinery, jars filled with unidentifiable contents and ritualistic markings etched meticulously into the walls. Every element seemed purposeful, sinister, designed to unsettle and intimidate. Every exit felt watched. Mirrors reflected fleeting images of figures where none should exist, and shadows moved independently, bending and stretching at impossible angles. Even the familiar street felt alien, every sidewalk tile and lamppost now part of an orchestrated trap. Pets refused to enter the room, growling at spaces that appeared empty. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, a distant car horn, even the wind through the trees, was amplified in the protagonist's mind, echoing as though the house itself responded to their fear. Street cameras captured fleeting figures outside, but no one was ever seen entering or leaving. The lights flickered irregularly, plunging sections of the yard into sudden darkness, revealing shapes for only moments before they vanished again. Whispers began to echo through the night, unintelligible but insistent. They seemed to crawl through the walls, brushing against the ears and the mind, repeating in cycles that made the protagonist's thoughts spiral. By now, the protagonist's paranoia had reached a peak. Every glance toward the house brought the sense that unseen eyes were following, watching every twitch, every heartbeat, every breath. The air itself seemed charged, heavy, as if the world had narrowed to a single point: the house. The breaking point wasn't just fear, it was the realization that whatever was in that house had already claimed a part of their life, and the longer they stayed, the more inescapable the presence became. Even retreating to the safety of home felt futile. The shadows lingered at the edges of vision. The whispers followed. The sense of being watched was now permanent, unrelenting and terrifying. The protagonist understood a horrifying truth. They were no longer merely observing. They had become part of the nightmare, and the nightmare had only just begun. Determined to escape, the protagonist grabbed their keys and headed toward the car. The night air was thick and heavy, carrying a strange, metallic tang that made their stomach churn. Every step felt monitored, every shadow a potential threat. When they reached the driveway, the tires were slashed. Panic surged through them. Someone had anticipated their attempt to leave. The mailbox, once empty, now contained a new note. "You can't leave yet." Heart pounding, they glanced toward the basement window. A fleeting glimpse revealed shadowy figures recording every movement, their shapes distorted, unrecognizable, yet undeniably alive. The lights inside the house pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, as if the building itself were sentient. The street plunged into sudden darkness. Streetlights flickered and died, leaving patches of black where shadows swirled unnaturally. A soft knock sounded at the window, slow and deliberate, though no one appeared outside. The protagonist retreated inside, locking every door, sliding the bolt with trembling hands. The house seemed to pulse around them, walls stretching and contracting ever so slightly, shadows pooling in corners, whispering just beyond hearing. Every ordinary sound became amplified. A creak in the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind rattling the blinds. Even breathing felt loud and intrusive. The sense of being observed was suffocating, relentless. From the corner of the room, mirrors reflected shapes that moved independently, figures appearing and vanishing in seconds. The protagonist realized with chilling clarity that they were no longer merely being watched. They were part of something far larger, far darker, far beyond comprehension. Outside, the house remained silent, its windows dark, yet the oppressive presence lingered. The street, once familiar and safe, had become an extension of the neighbor's dominion. Fear had taken root, spreading into every corner of reality, leaving the protagonist trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. By the time the night faded into the first hints of dawn, one terrifying truth remained. The house was alive, the neighbor was aware, and the protagonist's life had been irrevocably intertwined with a darkness that might never release them. Morning came, but it offered no relief. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, yet the room felt heavier, darker, as if the night's terror had left a residue that refused to dissipate. Every corner seemed to twitch with unseen movement, every shadow a lurking observer. The protagonist tried to convince themselves it was over, that the neighbor and the house were simply strange, but a nagging feeling refused to relent. The sense of being watched lingered, subtle but relentless, like a pulse beneath the skin. Even outside, the street no longer felt familiar. Every lamp-post seemed to bend slightly, every tree cast shadows that didn't match the morning sun. Birds avoided the area, their songs conspicuously absent, leaving an eerie silence that pressed in on all sides. A strange sound came from the basement window. Soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone testing the limits of reality itself. The protagonist froze, heart hammering, imagining what might be observing them, waiting for the next moment to intrude. Attempts to leave the house were met with anxiety and dread. The car tires, already damaged, reminded them of their previous failed escape. Even the thought of walking down the street brought a shiver, as if invisible eyes followed every step. Pets refused to enter certain rooms, growling and hissing at spaces where nothing seemed to exist. Even the air itself felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence that was both patient and deliberate. As they moved through the house, ordinary objects seemed subtly altered. A cup was not where it had been placed. A book lay open on an unfamiliar page. Each small change was a silent reminder. The house was alive, aware, and monitoring every action. Even reflections became untrustworthy. Mirrors seemed to hold more than the room's image. Shapes lingered behind the protagonist, figures bending around walls, always observing. By midday, the protagonist realized the horror was not a single night's terror. It had followed them, embedding itself into their reality, leaving them trapped in a world where normal rules no longer applied. The neighbor's presence was no longer limited to the house. It stretched, seeped, extended, unseen but undeniable, a pulse of menace in every corner, every sound, every shadow. The protagonist began to notice patterns that defied explanation. Objects weren't just moved, they formed sequences almost like messages. Books aligned on shelves, cups arranged on counters, even crumbs on the floor seemed deliberate, creating symbols too intricate to be accidental. Every flicker of light, every creak of the floor felt timed. Footsteps in the hallway echoed in rhythms that matched nothing natural, and shadows seemed to stretch in response to the protagonist's movements. Even the neighbor's appearances followed a subtle schedule. Though unpredictable at first, over days and nights, the protagonist began to anticipate where and when he might appear, only to discover that even predictions carried their own dangers. Streetlights outside pulsed at intervals that seemed almost like a code, casting long shadows that aligned strangely with the house and the protagonist's windows. The air felt charged, thick, and impossible to breathe fully, pressing against every inhale. Attempts to map or document the patterns yielded more questions than answers. Notes and recordings captured anomalies, but every attempt to explain them logically fell apart. Reality itself seemed warped around the house. Even the smallest sounds became threatening signals, a dripping faucet, a distant car horn, a bird landing on a branch. Each seemed to carry meaning, as if the house itself were communicating, warning, or manipulating. The protagonist realized with dawning horror that these patterns weren't random. They were a network, a web of control extending from the house, through the street, into every space they occupied. As the days went on, the sense of danger intensified. Nightfall brought more than darkness. It brought active malevolence. Windows would rattle without wind, lights flickered violently, and soft, unplaceable whispers crept through the air. The neighbor seemed almost omnipresent. Even when hidden inside, his silhouette could be glimpsed through cracks in blinds, distorted reflections in mirrors, or fleeting shadows across walls. It was impossible to tell if he moved or if reality itself shifted to show him. Ordinary objects became conduits of unease, a chair slowly tilting on its own, a book falling open to an ominous page, a faucet dripping in a rhythm that matched a whispered chant. The house and its inhabitant were asserting their influence everywhere. The protagonist's sleep was shattered. Dreams bled into reality, with shadows crossing ceilings, whispers curling around the ears, and fleeting figures at the edges of vision. Waking moments were no longer safe. The isolation of the street became suffocating. Neighbors avoided eye contact, leaving only silence, the oppressive quiet making every footstep, every heartbeat, and every rustle seem amplified, deliberate, threatening. The sense of being watched became unbearable. The protagonist realized the danger was no longer just the neighbor or the house. It had infiltrated their entire life, shadowing every movement, every thought. By the end of section 13, the protagonist understood a terrifying truth. Escape wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. The house, the neighbor, and the surrounding shadows had already woven a trap that extended beyond walls, beyond reason, and beyond understanding. The street seemed alive in ways the protagonist couldn't understand. At night, faint, deliberate thumps echoed through the walls, synchronized with the rhythm of their heartbeat. Objects moved with purpose, chairs tilted, doors creaked, and shadows shifted as if guided by unseen hands. The neighbor's presence became more aggressive. Windows would suddenly open on their own, revealing glimpses of his silhouette, leaning just far enough to provoke panic. His gaze felt omnipresent, a constant reminder that he was watching, waiting, orchestrating. Strange sounds came from the house itself, footsteps pacing in the empty rooms, whispering voices that seemed to crawl along the walls, and a low humming that resonated in the protagonist's chest. It was more than just unsettling, it was physically oppressive. The protagonist discovered small, unidentifiable objects placed strategically throughout the house, fragments of metal, pieces of paper with cryptic symbols, and stains that hadn't been there before. Each placement felt like a warning or a test. Pets became increasingly panicked. Dogs whimpered and hid, cats hissed at invisible figures, even insects avoided the areas closest to the house. The natural world itself seemed to recognize the malevolent energy surrounding the property. Attempts to leave the house were thwarted in subtle, terrifying ways. The driveway lights flickered violently, strange shadows blocked paths, and even the air felt resistant, thick and suffocating. Every step outside was a calculated risk. The neighbor never spoke directly, but his presence communicated everything. A tilt of the head, a slow movement behind a curtain, a flicker in the basement light. It was as if he were asserting dominance, reminding the protagonist that escape was no longer an option. By the following night, reality itself seemed unstable. Mirrors reflected moments that hadn't occurred yet, shadows bent in impossible directions, and whispers carried words the protagonist didn't understand but felt deep in the chest. Lights in the house pulsed erratically, revealing fleeting shapes, elongated figures, distorted limbs, and glimpses of faces that twisted in impossible expressions. Objects moved with deliberate force, as if the house were aware of the protagonist's presence and responding accordingly. Footsteps followed them from room to room, yet no one was there. Doors slammed softly, Lights flickered in perfect rhythm with the protagonist's heartbeat, and even the wind seemed directed, curling unnaturally around the house and the street. Outside, the shadows stretched longer than natural, merging with darkness in ways that obscured reality. The street itself felt like a trap, every familiar element now strange and threatening. The neighbor's figure appeared unexpectedly, always at the periphery of vision. A sudden movement behind a curtain, a fleeting reflection in glass, a shadow crossing the lawn, all communicated an unspoken message. You cannot escape. You cannot hide. You are ours now. By the end of section 15, the protagonist was fully aware that the danger wasn't just psychological, it was omnipresent, deliberate, and unstoppable. Every corner of their reality had been infiltrated, and there was no longer any sanctuary, only constant, creeping terror. Nightfall brought no relief. The protagonist's home seemed to pulse with malevolence, each shadow stretching unnaturally, each creak in the floor echoing with intent. Even the air felt charged, heavy, vibrating subtly with an unseen presence. Objects moved violently now, books toppled off shelves in precise patterns, chairs shifted positions while the protagonist wasn't looking, and faint scratches appeared on walls as though something had been testing the boundaries of reality itself. The neighbor became a ghostly figure, appearing in reflections at windows and across rooms in impossible ways. Every appearance was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet each left the protagonist shaken and disoriented. Whispers escalated into unintelligible chanting, curling through the house, wrapping around walls, and resonating in the protagonist's chest. Even the silence was loud, oppressive, as if reality itself had become a cage. Pets cowered in corners, refusing to move. The house seemed aware of their fear, reacting in ways that suggested intelligence and intent. Windows rattled without wind, lights flickered with alarming regularity, and shadows slithered across floors independently of any source. The protagonist's journal filled rapidly, recording every anomaly, lights, sounds, movements, and the unrelenting sense of observation. Patterns were emerging, but understanding them only heightened the sense of dread. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, aware, and actively hostile. The next day offered no comfort. Sunlight failed to penetrate the oppressive atmosphere that clung to the house. Even outside, the street felt alien. Shadows stretched across familiar paths in impossible angles, as if the world itself had been warped around the neighbor's presence. Objects began appearing where they hadn't been, small talismans of unknown origin, cryptic notes written in symbols that made the protagonist's skin crawl, and items that had vanished days ago reappearing in new, unsettling configurations. The neighbor's influence was pervasive. Even when absent, their figure could be glimpsed in reflections, fleeting movements in the corner of vision, and shadows that seemed to bend with intent. Every glance felt watched, every step calculated. The protagonist's dreams were invaded more aggressively. Figures moved in impossible ways, whispers became voices, and shadows reached out from ceilings and corners, tugging at the edges of consciousness. Sleep offered no escape, only a continuation of the waking terror. Electronic devices behaved erratically, phones rang with no caller, lights turned on and off, and the faint hum of distorted sounds filled empty rooms. The world itself seemed a stage for the neighbor's unrelenting control. By nightfall, it was clear the house and its occupant weren't just a threat. They were a force, a presence that had fully claimed the protagonist's perception of reality. Isolation, terror, and the inescapable gaze of the neighbor defined every waking and sleeping moment. The line between observer and participant had vanished. The protagonist had become part of the nightmare, trapped in a world that had been rewritten by the neighbor's malevolent influence. By now, the protagonist felt trapped in a world that no longer obeyed normal rules. The house seemed to pulse with life, walls subtly shifting, shadows crawling independently across the floor. Every sound, footsteps, creaks, even the wind, was amplified, deliberate, designed to unsettle. Objects moved with precision. Books fell open to ominous pages, mirrors reflected impossible figures behind the protagonist, and the faint glow of the basement light pulsed like a heartbeat, revealing fleeting, distorted silhouettes. Outside, the street had changed. Shadows bent unnaturally across sidewalks, trees cast darkness in impossible directions, and even the lampposts seemed alive, flickering in a rhythm that mirrored the protagonist's pulse. The neighbor became more than a figure, he was a presence. Even when unseen, the protagonist felt him observing, controlling, manipulating. A faint whisper of a name, a tilt of the head behind a curtain, a reflection in glass. All communicated silent warnings. You belong here now. Sleep offered no reprieve. Dreams were invaded with escalating intensity, elongated shadows, chanting voices, and distorted figures moving just beyond perception. Waking felt like an extension of the nightmare. The protagonist's attempts to escape grew frantic. Doors locked, windows barred, yet the oppressive presence infiltrated every corner. The house and street had become a single entity, alive and aware, and the protagonist's life was now entangled with its malevolent will. By the 19th section, the protagonist realized the neighbor's influence was omnipresent. Even in rooms far from the house, reflections revealed fleeting shapes, shadows lurked in corners, and whispers threaded through the air like a living entity. Electronic devices betrayed them. Phones rang with no caller, screens flickered with incomprehensible symbols, and alarms sounded without reason. Reality itself seemed rewritten, responding to the neighbor's will rather than natural laws. Pets cowered, refusing to move. Plants wilted unnaturally. Even the wind seemed directed, curling in unnatural arcs around the house and protagonist, enforcing the sense of surveillance and control. Objects inside the house began aligning into patterns that were both symbolic and threatening. Each new arrangement felt like a message, a ritual, a sign that the protagonist's world was no longer their own. The neighbor appeared unpredictably, always at the periphery of vision, in reflections, through windows, behind shadows. Each appearance reinforced the terrifying realization that the protagonist was no longer merely being observed. They were trapped, entangled, and fully claimed by this presence. By the end of section 19, the line between reality and nightmare had vanished. Every breath, step, and heartbeat was under the gaze of something beyond comprehension, leaving the protagonist utterly powerless and surrounded by an inescapable darkness. Night had fallen again, but the darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a presence, thick and suffocating, curling through the house and street like a living entity. The protagonist's breath came in ragged gasps, heart hammering against the chest, as every shadow seemed alive, every whisper a command. The neighbor appeared in ways impossible to explain. A flicker in a reflection, a distorted silhouette behind a curtain, shadows bending unnaturally across walls. All communicated the same message: you cannot escape. Objects now moved with alarming force. Books flew from shelves, chairs tipped over, and small items were thrown across rooms. Symbols and cryptic notes appeared in new places each hour, as if the house itself were arranging a ritual that the protagonist could neither understand nor stop. Windows rattled violently, doors slammed, and the walls seemed to pulse with an almost sentient rhythm. Whispers turned to low chanting, wrapping around the protagonist's mind, forcing panic to rise uncontrollably. Outside, shadows merged with darkness, creeping across sidewalks, lawn and street, as if the world itself had become a projection of the neighbour's will. The air was heavy, charged, almost magnetic, pulling at the protagonist's movements, dictating where they could step, where they could breathe. The neighbour's figure appeared suddenly in the corner of every reflection. No matter where the protagonist turned, the gaze followed, silent, deliberate, and overwhelming. The house, the street, and the neighbour had become a single, omnipresent force. By now it was clear the nightmare was complete. The protagonist's reality had been rewritten. Every moment, every movement, every thought was under observation. Escape was no longer just difficult, it was impossible. As the night reached its peak, the protagonist felt a final, chilling understanding. The new neighbour wasn't merely a person, the house wasn't merely a structure. They were manifestations of a darkness that had claimed this world, and the protagonist had been drawn irrevocably into its orbit. The only choice left was to survive, to endure, and to hope that somehow, just somehow, they could outlast the ever-watchful presence that now governed everything they knew. It started with a feeling, a faint tug of uncertainty that the protagonist couldn't explain. At first, it was almost imperceptible, like a shadow that didn't belong or a chill that lingered too long in a familiar room. The neighbour's behaviour had shifted subtly. Glances that once felt casual now lingered a moment too long, eyes tracking movements in ways that made the protagonist uneasy. Footsteps outside the window would pause when they approached, then resume as if nothing had happened. Doors that had been securely closed creaked open when no one should have been near them. The nights were the worst. Streetlights outside flickered in unnatural patterns, casting irregular shadows that twisted along walls. Those shadows sometimes seemed to pool in corners or stretch across hallways, curling in ways that defied reason. Each movement of light or shade carried the faint sense of observation, as if the house itself were listening. Inside, the house began to betray subtle signs of manipulation. Objects moved in ways that were just slightly off. A coffee mug would sit a little closer to the table's edge than before, a book leaned at a new angle, and a picture frame tilted imperceptibly. These small disturbances accumulated, forming a pattern that the protagonist couldn't dismiss. Even the protagonist's perception faltered. Hallways seemed longer than they should have been, rooms felt subtly altered, and the familiar layout of the house seemed to shift while unobserved. A glance out the window would reveal the vague outline of someone standing there, gone the instant attention turned. Sounds became distorted. Floorboards creaked above with no footsteps present. The wind outside carried tones that almost sounded like whispered words, just beyond understanding. The hum of electrical appliances seemed to pulse unnaturally, echoing in rhythm with the protagonist's heartbeat. The pets in the house began reacting strangely. Dogs froze mid-step, ears alert, staring into empty corners. Cats hissed at unseen threats, arching their backs and refusing to enter rooms that had been safe moments ago. Their instincts were warnings, subtle but impossible to ignore. Every small detail amplified the sense that something was wrong. Shadows, sounds, and movements conspired to keep the protagonist on edge. Familiar objects, once ordinary, now felt loaded with intent. Every hallway, every glance, every step was fraught with tension, as if the house had become alive, aware, and attuned to their presence. The protagonist moved carefully, measuring each action, knowing that even the smallest misstep could trigger another wave of unease. The environment seemed to watch, to respond, to anticipate, and every ordinary task became an exercise in caution. The house seemed to shift when the protagonist wasn't looking, almost imperceptibly at first. Curtains swayed even though the windows were closed, and floorboards creaked under no weight, releasing a tension that made the chest tighten. Shadows clung to the edges of rooms, stretching and curling in ways that felt deliberate, as if they were alive and observing. The neighbor's presence felt closer, though still elusive. Sometimes it appeared in peripheral vision, a flicker of movement at the corner of the eye, the faint outline of a head, a shadow that shifted slightly out of place. Every time the protagonist tried to focus, the glimpse vanished, leaving only the lingering impression that they were being watched. Objects continued their quiet rebellion. A cup slid a fraction of an inch closer to the table's edge. Books leaned at unnatural angles, as if nudged by an invisible hand. Doors that had been firmly shut now stood ajar, creaking softly in the stillness. Even the smallest items seemed to obey some unseen influence, moving in ways that teased both the mind and senses. Sounds began layering unnaturally. The soft scraping of a chair echoed down the hallway, even though it had never been moved. The ticking of a clock warped, sometimes rushing, sometimes slowing, as if time itself were bending around the house. Outside, the wind carried low, unintelligible murmurs, whispers that seemed to echo thoughts the protagonist hadn't spoken aloud. Perception faltered further. Shadows stretched across walls when no light should have reached them. Air currents brushed unexpectedly against the skin, sometimes warm, sometimes chilling, hinting at presences just out of sight. Even the hum of appliances seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat, amplifying tension with every pulse. The pets reacted more erratically. Dogs froze mid-step, ears pinned, eyes locked on corners that seemed empty. Cats hissed, arched their backs and refused to enter rooms that had once been safe. Their instinctive warnings added a layer of dread, confirming that something unseen was aware of the protagonist's movements. The protagonist moved cautiously, each step deliberate, glancing over shoulders and measuring every breath. Familiar spaces no longer offered comfort. Hallways, rooms, and staircases felt like a living maze, designed to confuse, unnerve, and keep them under constant observation. The ordinary became threatening. Picking up a cup, opening a drawer, walking across the floor, each act carried the faint but unmistakable weight of unseen eyes, and every shadow and sound reminded the protagonist that the house was no longer simply a home. It was a trap, alive with intent, and attuned to every movement. The nights grew heavier, and with them came a sound that made the protagonist's skin crawl, soft, low whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the hum of the house itself, but each passing night they grew louder, forming fragments of words that the mind struggled to interpret. The shadows became more daring. They crept along walls, pooled in corners, and sometimes stretched across hallways like tendrils. Every movement seemed deliberate, as though they were aware of the protagonist's gaze, avoiding direct detection, but never leaving. Even when lights were switched on, the shadows lingered, resisting illumination, twisting the familiar into something uncanny. Objects continued their subtle rebellions. A chair shifted slightly when the protagonist's back was turned. A book fell to the floor with a soft thud, though no one had touched it. Drawers opened a fraction, revealing nothing but the suggestion of intrusion. The air seemed to carry an invisible weight, pressing down, making every step feel laborious, every movement careful. Sounds layered unnaturally over one another. Floorboards creaked in tandem with the whispers, and the wind outside seemed to imitate the cadence of voices, carrying syllables that could not be understood, but were heavy with intent. Even the faint buzzing of appliances took on a rhythm that mirrored the protagonist's heartbeat, intensifying unease. The neighbor's presence became more tangible. A fleeting shape would appear at the edge of vision, a shadow in the hallway, a figure reflected in a window, gone the moment it was focused on. It was never direct, yet always there, a silent observer shaping fear without revealing itself. Pets reacted with increasing alarm. Dogs growled low, tails stiff, staring at corners of rooms that appeared empty. Cats hissed and retreated, refusing to enter areas that had always been familiar. Their instincts reinforced the sense that the house itself was no longer safe, that even the unseen held power. The protagonist moved with caution, glancing over shoulders, measuring every step. The ordinary became fraught with tension. Picking up a cup, adjusting a picture frame, or crossing a hallway carried the sensation of unseen eyes tracking every motion. The whispers in the dark were constant reminders. The house had awareness, and the protagonist was never alone. Even silence carried its own menace. When the whispers paused, the absence of sound was heavier, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was listening more intently, waiting for the smallest sign of vulnerability. Every moment felt charged, every movement a potential trigger for the unseen forces at play. The lights in the house began to betray the protagonist. At first, it was subtle, small flickers that might have been dismissed as electrical quirks. But soon the pattern became undeniable. Lights dimmed for no reason, flickered rhythmically, and sometimes cut out entirely, leaving rooms in total darkness, broken only by the shifting shapes of shadows that seemed to thrive there. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls and ceiling, elongating or curling in impossible angles. They didn't follow the contours of the room, but moved independently, slithering across floors, pooling in corners, and disappearing when glanced at directly. Even the familiar hallways seemed to warp when the lights shifted, making the protagonist hesitate with every step. Objects became unpredictable. Doors creaked open slowly, just wide enough to reveal darkness beyond. Chairs tilted slightly when no one was near. The faintest knock or thud would echo from a room that had been empty moments before. Every sound, every movement seemed purposeful, calculated to unnerve and unsettle. The neighbor's presence lingered in every flicker of light. Sometimes it appeared as a dark shape at the end of a hallway, other times reflected in windows, its features obscured but unmistakably watching. Each appearance was fleeting, always vanishing when attention was fully focused, leaving the protagonist questioning what was real. Auditory sensations grew unnerving. Whispers returned, low and incomprehensible, carried on the rhythm of flickering lights. Floorboards groaned in tandem, and even the hum of the appliances seemed to respond, pulsing with a life of its own. Every sound, every pause drew the protagonist deeper into a state of hyper-awareness, where ordinary noises became threats. The pets in the house reacted sharply. Dogs barked at corners that remained empty, ears pinned, bodies tense. Cats hissed and avoided certain rooms entirely, arched backs and dilated eyes, signaling danger invisible to human eyes. Their reactions were instinctive, alarming, and impossible to ignore. The protagonist moved carefully, step by step, hand hovering near walls for reassurance. Even the simplest actions, reaching for a book, turning a doorknob, crossing a hallway, felt laden with risk. Every flicker of light, every whisper, every shifting shadow reinforced the realization that the house itself had become an active participant in the fear, an environment aware and attuned to their presence. The sense of being watched had become unavoidable. Every room the protagonist entered carried the weight of unseen eyes. Even in the daylight, the house seemed to thrum with quiet anticipation, walls vibrating with a presence that could not be seen but could be felt. Footsteps echoed from rooms above, though the floors were empty. The faint shifting of furniture whispered from corners of the house where no one should have been. A doorknob would twitch slightly in the protagonist's hand, as if an invisible force were resisting, testing, or simply observing. Shadows had grown bold. They stretched across hallways, pooling unnaturally, elongating with intent. Sometimes they would flare along the walls in the peripheral vision, vanishing instantly when the protagonist turned to look. The mind strained to reconcile the ordinary with the impossible, each fleeting movement tugging at nerves already frayed. Objects no longer stayed where they were left. A cup on the counter might be found on the floor minutes later. Books slid along tables, papers shuffled into new arrangements. Small disturbances multiplied, creating a sense that the house itself was alive, orchestrating its own unsettling symphony. Sounds layered and intensified. Whispers returned, rising from the floorboards, from behind walls, and sometimes seeming to echo from the protagonist's own thoughts. The wind outside carried faint, indecipherable murmurs, wrapping the house in an audible tension that was impossible to ignore. The neighbor's presence became more immediate. A fleeting figure at the end of a hallway, a shadow in a reflection, a movement in the corner of the eye, always there, always watching, but never fully revealed. Each appearance was brief, leaving only a lingering feeling that every action was observed, catalogued, and used to heighten fear. Even the pets reacted with heightened alarm. Dogs stiffened, ears pinned, growling at nothing visible. Cats hissed, arched their backs and avoided rooms entirely, refusing to traverse areas that had once been familiar. Their instincts reinforced the protagonist's growing awareness that something beyond comprehension was present. Every ordinary action carried weight, picking up objects, turning corners, moving through hallways. Each step was measured, careful, deliberate. Every flicker of light, every creak, every whisper was a reminder that the house and its unseen occupant were always present, always attentive, and always waiting. Mirrors had become dangerous places. The protagonist noticed first that their reflection seemed just slightly delayed, a fraction of a second behind their own movements. At times, the reflection appeared altered, an edge of a shadow where none should be, a fleeting figure standing behind them that vanished when they turned. Windows, too, betrayed subtle distortions. On bright days, the reflections in the glass were just a touch off. Shapes moved behind the protagonist even when the yard was empty. Shadows flitted across the panes in impossible ways, stretching unnaturally across walls and ceilings, teasing the edge of perception. Objects in the house became more actively unsettling. A chair that had been pulled close to a table now faced the opposite direction. Drawers opened just wide enough to reveal nothing, yet the movement implied intent. Papers shuffled in stacks, books slid across tables, and even the air seemed heavy with the presence of unseen hands. Sounds layered unnaturally around the protagonist. Footsteps echoed from rooms they hadn't entered. Whispers rose and fell in cadence with their heartbeat. The ticking of clocks seemed to stretch and warp, time itself bending in rhythm with the oppressive atmosphere. Every creak and murmur amplified the sense that the house was alive and aware. The neighbor's presence lingered closer, though still unseen. A flash in the peripheral vision, a shadow stretching across the hallway, a subtle shift in the angle of light. These small, fleeting occurrences reminded the protagonist that someone, or something, was always observing. Even pets reacted with heightened sensitivity. Dogs froze, ears pricked, tails stiff, growling low at corners where nothing appeared to exist. Cats hissed and retreated from certain rooms entirely, refusing to traverse familiar territory. Their instincts reinforced the ever-present tension, an invisible alarm that the protagonist could not ignore. Every action required caution. Turning a doorknob, picking up an object, stepping into a hallway, each move was calculated and measured. Light, shadow, sound, and reflection all combined to create a web of awareness around the protagonist, reminding them that the house and its unseen occupant were always present, observing every detail, every hesitation. The house was no longer just a space, it had become a living, watching entity, and every reflection, every glimpse, every subtle movement reinforced that understanding. The protagonist began to feel the weight of observation in every room. It wasn't just the shifting shadows or the flickering lights anymore. It was the unmistakable impression that someone, or something, was present, quietly monitoring every movement. The air felt heavier, thick, with a tension that seemed to press down on the chest. Footsteps echoed across the house in impossible patterns. Above, along the ceiling, creaks followed a rhythm that wasn't natural, as if invisible feet paced in sync with their own. Doors would slowly swing open on their own, just enough to hint at intrusion without revealing anything. Objects moved subtly, books tilted, a cup shifted closer to the edge, a chair rotated slightly, but always carefully, purposefully, as though designed to unsettle. Shadows became more aggressive in their presence. They stretched and writhed across walls and floors, defying angles of light, sometimes curling around corners where the protagonist knew no object existed. Peripheral glimpses caught fleeting shapes, dark silhouettes that disappeared when looked at directly, leaving only the sense of being watched. The neighbor's influence was more apparent now, though still unseen. Sometimes it was the hint of a figure at the end of a hallway, the flash of movement in a darkened window, or the subtle shift of a shadow that had been still moments before. Always present, always observing, never revealed fully. Yet their presence was undeniable. Auditory disturbances layered on top of the visual ones. Low, unintelligible whispers slithered through the walls. Floorboards creaked where no one had stepped. Clocks ticked erratically, sometimes slowing, sometimes racing, warping the perception of time itself. The wind outside carried tones that seemed almost conscious, like faint voices shaping the atmosphere. The pets reacted with an almost supernatural awareness. Dogs froze mid-step, hackles raised, eyes locked on corners where nothing visible lingered. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and refused to enter certain rooms entirely. Their instinctive reactions heightened the protagonist's sense that the house itself, combined with the unseen neighbor, was aware of their presence. Every movement became deliberate. Each step down a hallway, each turn of a doorknob, each simple action carried the awareness that it might trigger the attention of the unseen watcher. The ordinary became tense, mundane movements weighted with the threat of being observed and the subtle, omnipresent pressure of something that had made the house its domain. Even familiar rooms no longer offered safety. The protagonist moved with care, constantly aware that nothing about the house or the unseen presence was predictable, and that every shadow, sound, and flicker of light could carry intent. The house seemed to shift with a will of its own. Shadows darted across walls where none should exist, pooling in corners and stretching along hallways as if alive. The protagonist felt the subtle brush of air against their skin, warm at times, chilling at others, each gust hinting at an unseen presence moving just beyond perception. Lights flickered unpredictably, throwing rooms into alternating gloom and sudden brightness. In those fleeting moments of clarity, shapes appeared at the edge of vision, a dark silhouette standing in the hallway, a figure in a window that vanished when looked at directly. The brief flashes were enough to make the heart race and the breath catch. Objects no longer stayed put. A chair shifted slightly when the protagonist turned away. Books slid a fraction across tables. Cups trembled as if touched by an invisible hand. Even the faintest sound, a soft tap, a low thud, was magnified by the oppressive silence, each one echoing with intent. Whispers returned, low and incomprehensible, carried on the rhythm of the house itself. Floorboards groaned in sync, and the hum of appliances seemed to pulse with life, each vibration amplifying unease. Even the ticking of clocks warped unpredictably, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, blurring the sense of time and heightening tension. The neighbor's presence lingered closer, though never fully revealed. Shadows shifted at the edges of vision, sometimes forming fleeting figures that disappeared when focused on. The protagonist could feel being tracked, measured, and studied with every move. The unseen observer's awareness had become tangible, wrapping the house and its inhabitant in an invisible web of scrutiny. The pets reacted instinctively. Dogs froze mid-step, ears pressed forward, eyes locked on unseen corners. Cats hissed and arched their backs, refusing to enter rooms they had always considered safe. Their reactions served as constant reminders that the environment was no longer ordinary, and that something beyond comprehension was present and aware. Even the protagonist's most mundane actions became tense exercises in caution. Crossing a hallway, turning a doorknob, picking up an object, every movement carried the weight of observation. Every flicker of light, every whisper, every subtle shift of shadow reminded them that the house, combined with the neighbor's unseen influence, was alive, deliberate, and attentive. The ordinary spaces of the home now seemed threatening, familiar rooms transformed into arenas of subtle terror. Every step, every glance, every breath carried the quiet, insistent reminder they were being watched. The protagonist noticed it first in the hallways. Corners that had always been sharp and predictable now seemed to twist subtly when unobserved. A hallway that had once ended in a familiar door now stretched slightly, making each step feel longer, heavier, as though the house itself resisted their passage. Shadows no longer stayed confined to walls. They curled along the floor, stretched across the ceiling, and pooled in corners where no light should reach. Sometimes they moved in patterns that suggested intent, brushing across the edges of vision just long enough to unsettle, then vanishing when fully looked at. Objects shifted without explanation. A chair that had been against the wall now faced the center of the room. Books tilted along tables, cups teetered at the edges, threatening to fall, though no one had touched them. Even the smallest disturbances carried a sense of purpose, as if the house were testing boundaries, learning the protagonist's reactions. Sounds became increasingly layered. The whispering returned, incomprehensible but insistent, echoing faintly from rooms the protagonist hadn't entered. Floorboards groaned in ways that didn't match their movements. The wind outside brought tones that sounded almost like voices, warped and distorted, carrying an eerie cadence. The neighbor's presence became more immediate. A shadow flickered at the end of the hallway, the outline of a figure in a window, a sudden dark form glimpsed in the peripheral vision, always fleeting, never fully revealed, yet impossible to ignore. The protagonist could feel being measured and tracked, every movement catalogued in silence. Pets reacted with growing unease. Dogs froze mid-step, bodies tense, ears pricked toward empty corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided familiar rooms entirely. Their instinctive caution reinforced the protagonist's understanding that the house and its unseen observer were aware, alert, and subtly manipulative. Even ordinary actions carried heightened tension. Turning a doorknob, crossing a hallway, reaching for an object, every movement was calculated, measured, deliberate. Shadows, sounds, and flickers of light kept the protagonist constantly on edge, making familiar spaces feel unfamiliar and ordinary moments feel loaded with unseen intent. The house was no longer simply a home. Its walls, corners, and corridors seemed to have a life of their own, guided by a force unseen, attentive, and deliberate, watching, testing, and shaping the protagonist's fear with each subtle distortion. The feeling of being watched had grown heavier, almost tangible, settling into every corner of the house. Even in the quietest moments, the protagonist felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing from the walls, the floor, and the shadows that now moved with intent. Footsteps echoed from rooms above, yet the floors were empty. A chair creaked as if someone had shifted it, though no one was there. Drawers opened a fraction, papers shuffled in neat piles, and small objects moved ever so slightly. The house itself seemed alive, responding to the protagonist's presence, anticipating each step and each glance. Shadows became bolder, stretching and curling across walls and ceilings in ways that defied the angles of light. Sometimes a fleeting silhouette appeared at the edge of vision, standing still, watching, and vanishing the moment the protagonist tried to focus. Every glance reminded them that the neighbor's influence was closer than ever, though still unseen. Sounds layered and distorted. The faint whispers returned, low and incomprehensible, drifting from hallways and walls. Floorboards groaned in unnatural rhythm. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to falter, speeding up and slowing down in ways that unnerved perception. The wind outside carried tones that seemed to echo consciousness, shaping the space with invisible intent. The pets reacted instinctively to the growing tension. Dogs stiffened, ears forward, growling low at corners that appeared empty. Cats hissed and arched their backs, avoiding rooms they had once walked freely. Their instincts amplified the protagonist's sense that the house and its unseen watcher were aware, calculating, and subtly manipulating every movement. Every mundane action became weighted, crossing hallways, opening doors, picking up objects, each step measured, cautious, deliberate. Flickers of light, shifting shadows, and distorted sounds combined to make familiar spaces feel hostile, making ordinary routines feel like exercises in careful observation. The house was no longer neutral. It had become a labyrinth of intent. Every room, every hallway, every corner seemed alive with awareness, and though the neighbor remained unseen, their presence threaded through the house like a quiet, unyielding force, shaping every moment of the protagonist's existence. The hallway seemed different now, though the protagonist knew it should be the same. Every step echoed strangely, as if the walls themselves absorbed sound and returned it altered. Shadows clung to the edges, twisting and elongating in ways that made familiar doorways feel unfamiliar. A faint whisper drifted from the end of the hallway, soft, unintelligible, yet undeniably present. The protagonist's heartbeat quickened, every nerve alert to movement and sound. The shadows shifted as if in response, flickering along the walls and pooling in corners just beyond vision. Objects moved subtly but deliberately. A book leaned against another, cups tilted ever so slightly, and a picture frame that had hung straight now leaned at an odd angle. Each movement suggested a careful, unseen hand at work, testing reactions and amplifying the sense of unease. The neighbor's presence lingered at the periphery of awareness. A fleeting silhouette appeared in the corner of the eye, a shadow reflected in the window, a shape that vanished when the protagonist turned. Though unseen directly, their attention was palpable, pressing down with an almost suffocating weight. Sounds layered unnaturally. Floorboards creaked where no one had stepped. Whispers rose and fell, echoing off walls, sometimes seeming to come from behind the protagonist, sometimes from ahead. Even the soft hum of appliances pulsed with a life of its own, accentuating the growing tension. The pets were uneasy. Dogs froze mid-step, ears forward, tails stiff, staring at corners with no visible presence. Cats hissed and retreated from rooms they had always considered safe, their instincts amplifying the sense of danger. Every movement became deliberate, crossing the hallway, adjusting a picture, picking up an object, Each action felt scrutinized, as though the house itself, guided by the unseen neighbor, was aware of every detail. Even familiar spaces now held threat. The ordinary was gone, replaced with a heightened awareness that every shadow, every whisper, every subtle movement might carry intent. The hallway, once mundane, now felt alive, listening, observing, and anticipating the protagonist's next move. The house had grown quieter, but the silence carried weight. It was the kind of stillness that made the protagonist's own movements sound loud, every creak of floorboards, every shift of clothing, echoing unnaturally. Shadows stretched longer in the dim light, curling along walls and pooling in corners where no light should reach. The neighbor's presence pressed closer, though still unseen. A fleeting shape at the end of a hallway, a shadow reflected in a window, a slight movement in the corner of vision. Each instance vanished when looked at directly, yet left a lingering awareness that someone was watching. Objects continued their subtle manipulations. A chair rotated slightly, books tilted along tables, drawers opened just enough to suggest intrusion, papers shuffling into new arrangements. Even the faintest sound, a soft tap, a thud, or a whisper of air, felt deliberate, calculated to heighten tension. Sounds carried unnervingly. Whispers moved through the walls, unintelligible but insistent, rising and falling like waves. Floorboards creaked under no apparent weight, and the hum of appliances pulsed in rhythm with the protagonist's heartbeat. Time itself seemed altered, clocks ticking erratically, stretching and contracting in ways that disoriented perception. The pet's instincts amplified the dread. Dogs froze, ears forward, staring at empty corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they had always traversed freely. Their caution confirmed that something unseen, aware, and deliberate occupied the space alongside the protagonist. Every action carried weight. Crossing a hallway, opening a door, picking up an object, each step measured, each breath deliberate. Shadows, sounds, and flickering lights reinforced the sense that the house and its unseen watcher were alive, attentive, and calculating. Even familiar spaces felt transformed. The ordinary became tense, mundane actions became exercises in caution, and every glance or movement was met with the subtle but unmistakable presence of something observing, shaping fear, and bending reality in small, disorienting ways. The protagonist began noticing corners that seemed to shift when unobserved. A hallway that had always ended at a familiar door now felt longer, narrower, almost curling inward. Shadows pooled differently in each room, stretching and writhing in ways that made the familiar space feel foreign. Objects moved subtly but deliberately. A book leaned slightly against another, cups teetered on the edge of tables, and picture frames tilted ever so slightly. Every minor adjustment carried the weight of unseen intention, creating an undercurrent of unease that the protagonist could not ignore. The neighbor's presence hovered, unseen yet palpable. Shadows flickered at the edges of vision, shapes formed in reflections, and fleeting movements appeared in corners that should have been empty. Every glimpse reinforced the sense that the protagonist was being watched, measured, and studied with careful attention. Sounds intensified. Floorboards groaned under no apparent weight. Whispers drifted along hallways, low and incomprehensible, sometimes echoing off walls, sometimes seeming to come from behind. Even the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of clocks seemed to pulse with a life of their own, echoing in rhythm with the protagonist's own heartbeat. The pets reacted instinctively. Dogs froze mid-step, bodies tense, ears pricked toward empty spaces. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they had previously crossed freely. Their heightened awareness was an unspoken warning, signaling that the house and the unseen neighbor were attentive and deliberate. Every step became calculated. Crossing hallways, adjusting objects, or picking up items required careful deliberation. Shadows, light, and sound combined to make ordinary spaces feel unpredictable and alive, transforming mundane actions into tense, cautious exercises. Even familiar rooms offered no comfort. Hallways, corners, and staircases seemed to shift subtly, creating a labyrinth of unease. Every glance, every movement, every creak of the floor reinforced the presence of the unseen, an entity quietly shaping fear and testing the protagonist's perception at every turn. The house no longer felt stable. Every step the protagonist took seemed to ripple through the rooms, as if the walls and floors themselves were aware of movement. Hallways stretched longer than memory allowed, corners warped subtly, and familiar doorways seemed to tilt just enough to make each passage feel unfamiliar. Shadows moved with purpose. They clung to the edges of walls, twisted along the ceiling, and pooled in corners where no light could reach. Sometimes a shape appeared at the periphery, a dark silhouette standing still before disappearing the instant the protagonist turned to look. Each glimpse left the lingering sense of being watched. Objects continued their subtle rebellion. A chair shifted, a cup wobbled slightly, a book slid a fraction across a table. Drawers opened just enough to suggest intrusion, papers rearranged themselves into new positions, and even the faintest creak or tap sounded deliberate, as if the house were learning how to unsettle the protagonist. Sounds became layered and unnerving. Floorboards groaned in irregular patterns, whispers floated through walls, and the hum of appliances seemed to pulse with life. Time itself felt distorted. Clocks ticked erratically, sometimes slowing, sometimes racing, disorienting perception and amplifying tension. The neighbor's presence lingered ever closer, shadows in windows, fleeting movements at hallway ends, and subtle shifts in reflection all hinted at observation. The protagonist could feel eyes on them at every moment, cataloguing every step, every glance, every breath. The pet's reactions grew more pronounced. Dogs froze, hackles raised, ears forward, eyes fixed on empty corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided areas once familiar. Their instincts confirmed that the house and its unseen presence were attuned to the protagonist, observing and manipulating even the smallest movements. Every ordinary action required caution. Turning a doorknob, picking up a book, crossing a hallway, each step measured and deliberate. Shadows, light, and sound combined to make familiar spaces feel unpredictable, and mundane routines became exercises in awareness and restraint. The house had become a living entity, attentive, deliberate, and aware. The protagonist understood that nothing within these walls was neutral anymore. Every movement, every glance, every creak carried the weight of observation and subtle manipulation. The protagonist felt it everywhere now, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes pressing down from walls, ceilings, and shadows that shifted just beyond perception. Every step felt measured, every breath deliberate, as if the house itself anticipated their movements and recorded them silently. Shadows moved independently, stretching along floors and walls, curling in corners where no light should reach. Sometimes a shape appeared in the periphery, a fleeting silhouette that disappeared when looked at directly. Each instance left a lingering sense of scrutiny that gnawed at the edges of the mind. Objects continued to betray expectation, chairs tilted slightly, cups trembled on tables, books slid a fraction of an inch, and drawers opened just enough to suggest intrusion. Even the smallest sounds, the faint tap of a foot, the shuffle of papers, felt deliberate, as if designed to unsettle and keep the protagonist alert. Sounds layered unnaturally. Whispered syllables drifted through walls, floorboards creaked without cause, and appliances hummed in erratic rhythm. The ticking of clocks warped, slowing and speeding at intervals that disoriented perception. The wind outside carried tones that sounded almost deliberate, like faint voices moving through the air. The neighbour's presence felt closer, though still unseen. A shadow at the end of the hallway, a flicker in a reflection, a subtle movement at the edge of vision. These fleeting signs reinforced the understanding that the protagonist was being observed, measured, and tested at every moment. Pets reacted instinctively. Dogs froze mid-step, hackles raised, ears pricked, eyes locked on invisible corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they had previously entered freely. Their behavior confirmed that the house and its unseen occupant were aware and deliberate in their presence. Even simple actions became exercises in caution. Crossing a hallway, opening a drawer, picking up a book, each move was calculated, deliberate, and heavy with the awareness of being watched. Shadows, flickers of light, and layered sounds transformed ordinary spaces into tense arenas of observation. The protagonist realized that the house was no longer simply a home. It had become a living entity, attentive, deliberate, and watchful, shaping fear in subtle, inescapable ways. Every corner, every shadow, every flicker was a reminder that they were never alone. The shadows had grown bolder. They no longer simply hugged corners or stretched along walls. They moved with intent, curling and twisting in ways that seemed almost alive. The protagonist felt their presence in every room, a subtle pressure that pressed against awareness without ever fully revealing itself. Lights flickered intermittently, sometimes casting the familiar hallways into darkness, sometimes illuminating shapes that had no business being there. A fleeting silhouette appeared at the edge of vision, a figure standing just beyond the doorway, vanishing when the protagonist turned to face it. Each glimpse sent a shiver down the spine, a silent warning that the neighbour's watchful presence was near. Objects continued to betray expectation. A chair rotated slightly when the protagonist's back was turned. Books slid across tables. Drawers opened or closed just enough to suggest manipulation. Even the smallest noises, the faint click of a cup, the shuffle of paper, felt deliberate, as though the house itself had grown sentient and attentive. The whispers returned, low and unintelligible, rising from the walls and floorboards. Every sound seemed layered, almost choreographed, echoing through the hallways and amplifying the tension in the air. Even familiar ticking clocks warped, stretching and compressing time, creating a disorienting rhythm that made each moment feel unpredictable. The neighbour's influence lingered closer still. Reflections in windows, fleeting figures at the end of hallways, and shadows in peripheral vision all reinforced the protagonist's awareness of being observed. Though unseen, the neighbour's presence shaped every movement, every glance and every thought with quiet precision. Pets remained hyper-aware. Dogs froze, ears pricked, eyes fixed on empty spaces. Cats hissed, arched their backs and refused to enter certain rooms entirely. Their instinctual reactions underscored the reality of the unseen presence, confirming that the house was no longer a safe space. Every action became deliberate and cautious. Crossing hallways, picking up objects, or even adjusting a picture frame carried weight. Shadows, flickers of light, and layered sounds transformed ordinary moments into tense exercises in awareness. The protagonist moved with care, knowing that every step was being watched, every breath noticed, every hesitation recorded. The house had become alive with unseen intent. Every room, every hallway, every corner seemed to pulse with awareness, shaping fear with subtlety, precision, and inescapable inevitability. For the protagonist, the house had shifted into a strange, oppressive stillness. It wasn't silence. There were always faint creaks, distant taps, and whisper-like echoes. But the calm was deceptive, heavy with intent. Every corner seemed to hold anticipation, as if the walls themselves were waiting for a movement that would reveal them. Shadows clung to edges in unnatural ways, They stretched along walls, pooled in corners, and sometimes seemed to move independently, flaring briefly when the protagonist's attention wavered. A fleeting silhouette might appear in a doorway or reflected in a window, disappearing instantly when looked at directly, leaving only a chilling sense of being watched. Objects continued to betray expectation. A chair that had been still now tilted slightly. Books slid across tables, drawers opened fractionally, papers shuffled subtly, and even the smallest sound, a cup clicking against a countertop, a faint tap, felt deliberate, intended to unsettle. Whispers returned, low and persistent, drifting through walls and floors. The hum of appliances pulsed irregularly, and clocks ticked erratically, their rhythms disorienting perception. The air itself seemed charged, carrying the faintest pressure of observation, pressing on the protagonist's awareness with every breath. The neighbor's unseen presence became more palpable, a fleeting shadow in a hallway, a subtle reflection in the glass, a dark shape at the edge of vision, all reminders that the protagonist was being observed constantly. Their attention, though hidden, shaped the very rhythm of the house and the protagonist's movement within it. The pets reacted instinctively. Dogs froze, ears forward, eyes locked on corners without visible cause. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided certain rooms entirely. Their behavior confirmed that something unseen, deliberate and aware, shared the space with the protagonist. Every action became a careful exercise, crossing hallways, opening doors, handling objects. Each step was measured, deliberate, and heavy with the awareness that it might trigger the unseen presence. Shadows, light, and sound combined to transform ordinary spaces into tense arenas of observation. The house no longer felt neutral. Its walls, corners, and hallways pulsed with awareness, shaping fear subtly yet persistently. Every glance, every movement, every sound reminded the protagonist that they were never truly alone. The sense of being watched had become nearly suffocating. Every room felt alive with subtle movements. Every shadow carried intent, and even the stillest air seemed charged with observation. The protagonist moved cautiously, knowing that each step might provoke a reaction from the unseen presence. Shadows stretched unnaturally, curling along walls and floors. Shapes appeared fleetingly at the periphery, figures standing just beyond the doorway or reflected in windows, and vanished the instant the protagonist turned to look. Each glimpse reinforced the constant awareness of being measured, studied, and scrutinized. Objects no longer stayed where they belonged. A cup tilted slightly, a book slid across a table, and drawers opened fractionally, hinting at an invisible hand's presence. Even the smallest sounds, a faint tap, a creak, a shuffle of papers, seemed deliberate, part of an unspoken pattern designed to unsettle and provoke unease. Whispers echoed from the walls and floorboards, low, incomprehensible, and persistent. Floorboards groaned in erratic patterns, and the hum of appliances pulsed subtly, creating an auditory tension that heightened every heartbeat. Clocks ticked unevenly, stretching and compressing time in a way that made reality feel unstable. The neighbor's unseen influence became more immediate. A shadow flickered at the end of the hallway, a subtle shape in a reflection, movements at the edge of vision, all reminders that the protagonist was constantly observed. The presence shaped the rhythm of the house and dictated the protagonist's actions, even without revealing itself fully. Pets reacted instinctively. Dogs froze, ears pricked, eyes fixed on corners when nothing appeared. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided certain rooms entirely. Their instincts confirmed the presence of something unseen, deliberate, and aware. Every movement was careful, deliberate, and weighted. Crossing a hallway, opening doors, picking up objects, mundane actions became exercises in awareness and caution. shadows, sounds, and light created an environment where ordinary spaces felt unpredictable and subtly threatening. The house had become a living, observing entity. Walls, hallways, and corners pulsed with attention, and the protagonist knew with certainty that every glance, step, and breath was watched, shaping fear in subtle, relentless ways. The protagonist felt the house tightening around them, as though walls, ceilings, and floors had grown sentient, reacting to every movement. Shadows stretched longer, corners seemed to close in, and familiar spaces suddenly felt alien, as if the house itself were reshaping reality around them. Shifts in light and shadow played tricks on the eyes. A fleeting silhouette appeared at the end of a hallway, a reflection in the glass showed movement where there was none, and shapes seemed to shift imperceptibly just beyond vision. Each glimpse reinforced the constant awareness of being observed, a silent but pressing presence that weighed on every nerve. Objects betrayed expectation more aggressively now. A chair rotated slightly, cups trembled, books slid across tables, and drawers opened fractionally. Even the faintest sound, a soft tap, a creak, or a shuffle, felt deliberate, designed to unnerve and manipulate perception. Whispers echoed in layers throughout the house. Low, unintelligible syllables rose and fell, drifting through walls and floors. Floorboards groaned unnaturally, appliances hummed erratically, and clocks ticked in unpredictable rhythms, creating disorientation and a creeping tension that made each moment heavy. The neighbor's unseen presence pressed closer. Shadows, fleeting figures, and subtle reflections reinforced that the protagonist was under constant scrutiny. Each step, glance, and motion was measured, catalogued, and subtly influenced by the invisible observer. The pet's behavior grew more pronounced. Dogs froze mid-step, hackles raised, ears forward, eyes locked on unseen corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and refused to enter previously familiar rooms. Their instincts confirmed the house and its unseen occupant were alive, attentive, and deliberately influencing the environment. Every movement carried weight. Crossing hallways, opening doors, adjusting objects, all became exercises in caution and awareness. Shadows, light, and layered sounds transformed ordinary actions into tense, deliberate maneuvers. The house was no longer neutral. It had become a living, observing force. Every room, hallway, and corner pulsed with attention, shaping fear with subtlety, precision, and relentless inevitability. The protagonist felt the full pressure of that observation in every moment. The protagonist felt every corner of the house observing them, the weight of unseen eyes pressing in with an almost tangible intensity. Shadows stretched unnaturally, curling along walls and pooling in corners as if alive, reacting to every movement. Each glance toward a hallway, each step, seemed to draw the attention of something patient and deliberate. Shapes flickered at the periphery of vision, figures standing just beyond doorways, reflections in windows that vanished when looked at directly. The sense of being tracked was unrelenting, a quiet pressure that threaded through every room, every hallway, every shadowed space. Objects betrayed expectation more frequently. A chair shifted slightly, cups trembled, books slid, drawers moved fractionally, and even the smallest sounds, a faint tap, a soft creak, felt like part of a carefully orchestrated pattern meant to heighten unease. Whispers threaded through walls and floorboards, low and incomprehensible, rising and falling unpredictably. Floorboards groaned, appliances hummed erratically, and clocks ticked irregularly, warping the perception of time. The ordinary became disorienting. The house seemed alive and aware, subtly shaping the protagonist's sense of reality. The neighbor's unseen presence felt impossibly close. Shadows, fleeting figures, and subtle reflections reinforced that every action was being observed. Their attention was deliberate, shaping each movement, each hesitation, each breath, though no form was ever fully revealed. The pet's instincts confirmed the danger. Dogs froze mid-step, hackles raised, ears pricked, eyes locked on empty corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs and avoided rooms they had previously traversed freely. Their heightened awareness mirrored the protagonist's growing realization that the house and its unseen occupant were in control. Every action became a careful exercise in awareness, crossing hallways, opening doors, handling objects, mundane movements were weighted with the knowledge of observation. Shadows, light and sound transformed familiar spaces into tense arenas of scrutiny. The protagonist understood that the house was no longer merely a setting. It had become a participant, alive with intent, and the neighbor's unseen presence was orchestrating a silent game of observation, manipulation, and fear. Every moment, every glance, every breath was under quiet, inescapable scrutiny. The darkness of the house no longer offered comfort. Every shadow seemed to harbor attention, and every dimly lit corner felt like it could reveal something watching. The protagonist moved cautiously, aware that even the smallest movement might provoke a reaction from the unseen presence. Shadows twisted unnaturally along walls and floors, curling and stretching in ways that defied logic. Fleeting shapes appeared at the periphery, figures standing at doorways or reflected in windows, and vanished the moment the protagonist focused on them. The sense of constant surveillance pressed down, subtle but insistent. Objects continued to betray expectation. Chairs tilted, books shifted, cups trembled slightly, and drawers opened fractionally. Even the smallest sounds, a soft creak, a gentle tap, or the shuffle of paper, felt purposeful, designed to unsettle and maintain the protagonist's heightened awareness. Whispers drifted through the air, low and incomprehensible, weaving through walls and floorboards. Floorboards groaned unpredictably, appliances hummed with subtle irregularity, and clocks ticked in uneven patterns, warping perception and amplifying unease. The neighbor's unseen influence lingered nearby. Shadows, fleeting figures, and subtle reflections reminded the protagonist that every action was being observed. Though never directly seen, the presence shaped movements, attention, and awareness, orchestrating a quiet tension in every moment. The pet's behavior reinforced the growing fear. Dogs froze mid-step, hackles raised, ears forward, eyes fixed on empty corners. Cats hissed and arched their backs, avoiding rooms they had once crossed freely. Their instincts confirmed that something deliberate and attentive shared the space. Every motion became calculated, crossing a hallway, opening a drawer, adjusting an object. Each action carried the weight of observation. Shadows, light, and sound transformed ordinary moments into exercises in tension and cautious awareness. The house itself seemed alive, attuned to the protagonist's movements, shaping fear with quiet precision. Every corner, every shadow, every flicker of light reminded them that they were never truly alone. The house no longer felt fixed. Hallways seemed to stretch and bend slightly when unobserved, and familiar rooms felt subtly different, as if the architecture itself was alive and watching. Every step the protagonist took carried the weight of awareness, every movement observed by an unseen presence. Shadows flickered unpredictably, stretching along walls and pooling in corners. Shapes appeared briefly at the edge of vision, a silhouette at a doorway, a reflection in the glass, but vanished when directly looked at. Each glimpse reinforced the sense that the house was alive with intent, attentive and deliberate. Objects continued to move subtly. Chairs tilted, books shifted, cups wobbled on tables, and drawers opened just enough to suggest intrusion. Even faint sounds, the creak of a floorboard, The tap of a cup, the shuffle of paper, felt intentional, designed to unsettle and heighten awareness. Whispers floated through walls and floors, low and persistent, drifting unpredictably. Floorboards groaned in irregular patterns, appliances hummed unevenly, and clocks ticked erratically, warping perception and creating an uneasy rhythm that disoriented the senses. The neighbor's unseen presence felt closer. Shadows at hallway ends, subtle shapes in reflections, and fleeting movements at the edges of vision reminded the protagonist that they were under constant observation. Every action, hesitation, and glance was measured and catalogued. Pets reacted instinctively. Dogs froze, ears pricked, eyes fixed on empty corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided previously familiar rooms. Their instincts confirmed the deliberate, attentive presence that haunted the house. Even ordinary actions required caution. Crossing hallways, opening doors, adjusting objects, all became exercises in awareness. Shadows, light, and sound transformed mundane spaces into tense arenas of observation and subtle fear. The house itself seemed alive, attuned to the protagonist's every movement. Every room, corner, and corridor pulsed with quiet attention, shaping unease in ways that were subtle, yet relentless. The protagonist had begun to notice corners that seemed alive. Hallways ended differently than memory suggested, and doorways appeared slightly shifted when glanced at indirectly. Shadows clung and twisted unnaturally, pooling where light should have reached, curling at edges and moving subtly in rhythm with unseen attention. Shapes flickered in peripheral vision. A figure appeared at the far end of the hallway, a fleeting reflection in a window, a silhouette that vanished the instant the protagonist turned. The constant awareness of being observed pressed like a weight on every nerve, making even familiar spaces feel alien. Objects continued to betray expectation. A chair leaned slightly, books slid along tables, cups teetered on edges, and drawers opened fractionally. Even the faintest creaks or taps felt deliberate, as though the house itself, guided by unseen hands, was actively unsettling its occupant. Whispers drifted through walls and floors, low and incomprehensible, layering over one another and echoing in unpredictable patterns. Floorboards groaned irregularly, appliances hummed with subtle distortions, and clocks ticked unevenly, warping perception of time and space. The neighbor's unseen presence lingered at the edge of awareness. Shadows, fleeting shapes, and subtle reflections reminded the protagonist that every action was monitored. Their attention, quiet yet deliberate, shaped the environment and dictated the protagonist's movements without ever fully revealing itself. Pets responded instinctively. Dogs froze, ears pricked, eyes fixed on corners that appeared empty. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they once navigated freely. Their heightened awareness confirmed the deliberate, watchful force that had taken hold of the house. Every action became cautious and deliberate. Crossing a hallway, picking up objects, adjusting furniture, all carried weight under the persistent gaze of unseen eyes. Shadows, sound, and flickers of light transformed ordinary moments into tense, heightened exercises in vigilance. The house had become alive with intent. Every corner, every shadow, every subtle movement carried the reminder that the protagonist was being observed and that the unseen presence orchestrated fear in subtle, inescapable ways. The shadows had grown more unpredictable. They no longer merely followed corners or clung to walls. They moved with subtle intent, curling and stretching in ways that made the protagonist's skin crawl. Every glance toward a hallway, every step taken, seemed to provoke their restless motion. Fleeting shapes appeared at the edge of vision, a figure standing in a doorway, a dark reflection in a window, a silhouette that dissolved when focused on directly. The constant awareness of observation pressed down on the protagonist, leaving a persistent feeling of unease that clung to the bones. Objects continued their quiet betrayals. A chair rotated slightly, a cup trembled, books slid imperceptibly across tables, and drawers opened fractionally. Even the smallest creaks, taps, or shuffles seemed deliberate, as if orchestrated by the unseen presence inhabiting the house. Whispers drifted through the walls and floorboards, low and unintelligible, layering over one another in unpredictable rhythms. Floorboards groaned without cause, appliances hummed erratically, and clocks ticked in uneven patterns, creating a warped perception of time that left the protagonist off balance. The neighbor's unseen presence loomed ever closer. Shadows, fleeting figures, and subtle movements at the edges of vision reminded the protagonist that every action was being catalogued and scrutinized. Even hesitation or stillness felt observed and measured. The pet's instincts amplified the tension. Dogs froze mid-step, ears forward, eyes fixed on empty corners. Cats hissed and arched their backs, avoiding rooms they had once entered freely. Their behavior reinforced the presence of a deliberate, aware, and unseen force controlling the environment. Every movement became a careful exercise. Crossing hallways, opening doors, adjusting objects, mundane actions were now deliberate, calculated, and heavy with the awareness of observation. Shadows, light, and sound transformed familiar spaces into tense arenas of fear. The house had become a living, breathing entity. Walls, corridors, and corners pulsed with awareness, and the protagonist felt that every glance, step, and breath was observed, subtly shaping fear and anticipation at every turn. The protagonist's every movement felt weighted with observation. The house seemed to watch, every shadow twisting in subtle, unnatural ways, every corner brimming with attention. Even in familiar rooms, the air carried a tension that made each breath feel heavy and deliberate. Shadows flickered along walls and floors, sometimes curling at edges, pooling in corners, or stretching in ways that defied logic. Fleeting silhouettes appeared at the periphery, a figure in a doorway, a reflection in a window, vanishing the instant the protagonist focused on them, leaving only the lingering impression of constant scrutiny. Objects continued their subtle betrayals. Chairs tilted, books slid slightly, cups wobbled, and drawers opened just enough to suggest intrusion. Even faint creaks, taps, or shuffles felt purposeful, orchestrated by an unseen presence that was learning the protagonist's patterns and manipulating the environment accordingly. Whispers echoed through walls and floors, low and persistent, layering over one another in unintelligible rhythms. Floorboards groaned unpredictably, appliances hummed with erratic pulses, and clocks ticked in uneven cadences, warping time and disorienting perception. The neighbor's presence remained close, though unseen. Shadows at hallway ends, subtle shapes in reflections, and fleeting movements reminded the protagonist that every action was being watched and measured. Each hesitation, glance, or movement was noted and weighed, reinforcing the pressure of observation. The pets responded instinctively. Dogs froze mid-step, hackles raised, ears forward, eyes locked on empty corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they had once entered freely. Their behavior confirmed that something unseen, deliberate, and aware inhabited the house. Every action became careful and deliberate. Crossing hallways, opening doors, handling objects, mundane movements transformed into tense exercises in awareness. Shadows, light, and sound created an environment where ordinary spaces felt unpredictable and subtly threatening. The house had become alive with intent. Every room, corner, and hallway pulsed with observation, shaping the protagonist's fear with precision and relentless subtlety. Every glance, step, and breath carried the unspoken weight of unseen eyes. The protagonist moved through the house with heightened caution, every step deliberate, every breath measured. Shadows no longer simply fell where light failed, they lingered, curling and twisting as if alive, reacting to movement and presence in subtle, unnerving ways. Fleeting shapes appeared at the edges of vision. A silhouette in a doorway, a reflection in a window, a shadow that shifted when attention was focused elsewhere. Each instance reinforced the constant sense of being watched, of every action catalogued by something unseen yet deliberate. Objects continued their subtle betrayals, chairs rotated slightly, books shifted along tables, cups teetered precariously, and drawers opened fractionally. Even the smallest noises, the creak of a floorboard, the tap of a cup, the shuffle of paper, felt purposeful, designed to unsettle and manipulate the protagonist's awareness. Whispers drifted through walls and floorboards, low, indistinct, and persistent. Floorboards groaned in irregular patterns, appliances hummed with subtle distortions, and clocks ticked unevenly, warping the perception of time and making each moment feel unpredictable. The neighbor's unseen presence lingered close, shaping the environment silently. Shadows at hallway ends, subtle movements in reflections, and fleeting peripheral shapes reminded the protagonist that observation was constant, that each glance, step, and hesitation was noted. Pets reacted instinctively. Dogs froze, ears pricked, eyes fixed on corners that appeared empty. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided previously familiar rooms entirely. Their instincts confirmed that a deliberate, watchful force had taken hold of the home. Even the simplest actions required caution. Crossing hallways, opening doors, adjusting objects, each movement was deliberate, heavy with awareness of unseen eyes. Shadows, light, and sound transformed ordinary spaces into tense arenas of observation. The house itself felt alive, its walls and corners pulsing with attention. Every glance, step, and breath carried the weight of the unseen presence, subtly shaping fear and maintaining a relentless tension that the protagonist could neither escape nor ignore. The atmosphere in the house had thickened, each breath feeling heavier than the last. Shadows moved with more confidence, stretching along walls and pooling in corners, creating an almost tangible pressure in the air. The protagonist sensed that the house itself was alive, responsive, and aware of every step. Shapes flickered at the edges of vision. A fleeting figure appeared at the end of a hallway, a reflection in a window twisted unnaturally, and shadows moved subtly when attention shifted elsewhere. The constant sensation of being observed pressed down relentlessly, creating a tension that clung to every nerve. Objects continued their subtle betrayals. Chairs tilted, books shifted slightly, cups trembled, and drawers opened fractionally. Even minor noises, a soft tap, a faint creak, the shuffle of papers felt deliberate, orchestrated to keep the protagonist on edge and aware of every moment. Whispers drifted through walls and floorboards, low, persistent, and layered. Floorboards groaned unpredictably, appliances hummed with subtle irregularity, and clocks ticked erratically, warping perception and making the ordinary seem alien. The neighbor's unseen presence grew more pressing. Shadows, fleeting shapes, and subtle reflections reminded the protagonist that observation was constant. Every hesitation, glance, and movement was noted, catalogued, and subtly influenced, creating an invisible game of control and fear. Pets' instincts remained sharp. Dogs froze mid-step, ears pricked, eyes fixed on empty corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they had once entered freely. Their behavior confirmed the persistent, deliberate presence that haunted the house. Every movement became calculated, crossing hallways, opening doors, handling objects. Mundane actions transformed into tense exercises in awareness. Shadows, light, and sound transformed ordinary spaces into arenas of quiet, relentless pressure. The house itself pulsed with life, each wall, corner, and hallway imbued with awareness. Every glance, every step, every breath was observed, shaping fear subtly yet unyieldingly. The protagonist could feel the weight of unseen eyes in every movement and moment. The protagonist felt the house pressing in more than ever. Each hallway seemed narrower, each room slightly altered, as though the walls themselves were aware and responsive to presence. Shadows no longer rested passively. They twisted, shifted, and pulled, reacting to movement with subtle intent. Shapes flickered at the edges of perception, a figure lingering at the end of a hallway, a reflection in the window that warped unnaturally, or a shadow that moved when the protagonist's attention was elsewhere. Each instance intensified the unrelenting sense of being watched. Objects continued their quiet betrayals. Chairs tilted, books shifted, cups trembled, and drawers opened just enough to suggest interference. Even faint sounds, a creak, a tap, or a shuffle, felt purposeful, deliberate, a language of subtle manipulation that the house and its unseen occupant seemed to share. Whispers layered through the walls and floorboards, low, indistinct, and persistent. Floorboards groaned in irregular patterns, appliances hummed unevenly, and clocks ticked erratically, creating a disorienting rhythm that heightened every heartbeat and sense of unease. The neighbor's unseen presence pressed closer. Shadows at hallway ends, fleeting reflections, and subtle movements reinforced that observation was constant. Every hesitation, glance, or motion was noticed, shaping the protagonist's awareness and behavior without revealing the watcher fully. The pet's instincts amplified the tension. Dogs froze mid-step, ears pricked, eyes locked on corners that appeared empty. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they had once entered freely. Their heightened awareness confirmed that something deliberate and attentive shared the home. Even ordinary actions required extreme caution. Crossing hallways, opening doors, adjusting objects, every move was weighted with the knowledge of unseen eyes. Shadows, light, and sound transformed mundane spaces into tense arenas of fear. The house had become a living, observing entity. Walls, corridors, and corners pulsed with intent. Every glance, step, and breath carried the weight of unseen observation, subtly shaping fear and anticipation with relentless precision. The silence of the house had taken on a weight of its own. It wasn't empty, it was charged, alive with the sense of observation. Each footstep echoed unusually, each breath sounded amplified, as though the house itself recorded and reacted to the protagonist's every movement. Shadows moved subtly, stretching along walls and pooling in corners. Fleeting shapes appeared at the edge of vision, a figure at a doorway, a reflection in glass, a silhouette that vanished when focused on. The constant sensation of being watched pressed down relentlessly, making familiar rooms feel alien and threatening. Objects continued to betray expectation. Chairs tilted, books shifted, cups trembled, and drawers opened slightly, as if influenced by invisible hands. Even the smallest creaks, taps, or shuffles felt deliberate, designed to heighten tension and keep the protagonist in a heightened state of awareness. Whispers floated through walls and floorboards, low and persistent, overlapping in layers. Floorboards groaned in irregular patterns, appliances hummed erratically, and clocks ticked unevenly, warping perception of time and reinforcing the subtle sense of chaos within the home. The neighbor's unseen presence remained close, influencing the environment with quiet precision. Shadows at hallway ends, subtle reflections, and movements at the edges of vision reminded the protagonist that every action was observed. Hesitation, glances and motions were catalogued, shaping the protagonist's awareness and fear. The pets responded instinctively. Dogs froze, ears forward, eyes locked on corners that appeared empty. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they had once entered freely. Their behavior confirmed that a deliberate, watchful presence occupied the house alongside the protagonist. Every motion required careful calculation, crossing hallways, opening doors, handling objects. Mundane actions became tense exercises in vigilance. Shadows, light, and sound transformed ordinary spaces into arenas of subtle pressure and unease. The house itself felt alive, attentive, and controlling. Walls, corridors, and corners pulsed with awareness, subtly shaping fear, anticipation, and the protagonist's every decision. Every glance, step, and breath carried the weight of observation that could never be ignored. The protagonist felt every corner of the house alive with intent. Shadows no longer simply fell, they moved with purpose, curling along walls, stretching into corners, and lingering where attention should have been. Every glance, every step, every subtle motion was observed, catalogued, and shaped by the unseen presence. Fleeting shapes appeared at the edges of vision, a figure in a doorway, a reflection in glass, a shadow that shifted and vanished when focused on. The house had become a labyrinth of observation, every room alive with subtle movements and quiet manipulations. Objects betrayed expectation with increasing frequency. Chairs tilted, books slid along tables, cups trembled, and drawers opened fractionally. Even the faintest creaks, taps, or rustling of paper felt intentional, orchestrated to maintain tension and reinforce the constant awareness of being watched. Whispers wove through walls and floorboards, low and persistent, layering over one another in unpredictable rhythms. Floorboards groaned, appliances hummed irregularly, and clocks ticked unevenly, stretching and compressing time, disorienting perception, and intensifying the sense of unease. The neighbor's presence felt impossibly close. Shadows at hallway ends, fleeting figures in reflections, and subtle movements reminded the protagonist that every hesitation, glance, and motion was being monitored. Observation was constant, deliberate, and inescapable. The pet's instincts were undeniable. Dogs froze mid-step, ears forward, eyes fixed on empty corners. Cats hissed, arched their backs, and avoided rooms they had once entered freely. Their behavior confirmed the presence of a sentient, attentive, and deliberate force in the house. Even ordinary actions became exercises in caution. Crossing hallways, opening doors, adjusting objects, all were deliberate, each movement weighted with the knowledge of unseen eyes. Shadows, light, and sound transformed mundane spaces into tense arenas of observation and subtle manipulation. The house itself had become alive, imbued with awareness. Every wall, corridor, and corner pulsed with intent. Every glance, step, and breath carried the weight of observation. The unseen presence shaped fear, anticipation, and perception, creating a subtle but relentless tension that enveloped the protagonist completely. And there you have it, the chilling tale of the new neighbor and the unseen presence that turned an ordinary house into a place alive with observation and subtle terror. By now you felt the tension in every creaking floorboard, the weight of every lingering shadow, and the quiet pressure of being watched. These aren't just stories, they're reminders of how easily the familiar can twist into something unknowable, how ordinary spaces can hide the extraordinary and terrifying. If tonight's tale left you on edge, you're not alone. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever felt a presence watching you, even when you were alone? Drop your experiences in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how wide this creepy little community stretches across the world. If you love these stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, because we bring new nightmares every single day, perfect for late nights and sleepless hours. And remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones lurking just out of sight, waiting, watching, silently. Thanks for spending these hours with us. Until next time, stay aware, stay safe, and keep the lights just a little brighter tonight.